A very good morning, and thank you for your time, Mr. Nico Kleynhans.
Jonathan, I want to tell the listeners 4 stories today, because dealing with death and dying, it's not an easy topic to do. So if I tell the stories, it becomes a little easier. The first one, Dad died. And the family had to deal with the settling of the estate. And so they turned to the eldest son, and they said, you negotiate with the attorneys and you get things processed. 2 years later, Mom began to feel uneasy about something. And she sat down with her son and said, is there something you should tell me? And he said, yes, I have stolen Dad's money. And you won't take me to the police because I'm your son. Folks, when it comes to estate planning, you cannot put that burden on family members because it opens up problems, and you are then faced as a parent with a very difficult situation. Make sure that the will is drawn up by a professional, and make sure that a professional is handling the estate. Number 2, he worked for the police. His actual job in the police was to look after very prominent politicians. They stayed in a home provided by the police department. While he was in exile, he produced children in every country he visited, and he didn't tell his wife. While he was on duty in South Africa, he was killed. And now all these mothers began to appear. And the rules in South Africa say that the pension fund gets distributed amongst all the children, regardless of who the mother is. So now we've got mothers from country A, B, C, D. They're getting a small share. Their kids are getting an equal share with his kids. And we've got a South African mother who has now got a pension less than 50% of what she was expecting. And because he lived in exile, only the pension money was available to his family. Now, in addition to that, because they lived in a police house, the police put them out because the father, the employed, had died. She was not employed by police. And so she found herself homeless with a reduced income and really struggling to survive. Now, we are going to nod our heads and say, well, that's the government. But you know, you will not believe how many churches have been started by a single pastor who serves there his whole life, whose widow lives now in a house belonging to the congregation. And her experience is exactly the same as what happens. So we need to be careful, especially for those non-denominational churches, because you don't have the backup. It's going to be the first time your pastor has died, and you're not necessarily going to have the funding to support the widow and to provide for the new church. So you've got to do some planning. Client number 3 worked on board a ship. He was an electrician. It was one of these ships somewhere in the Caribbean. It was not a good company. And people who work on ships have very little rights and protection. And while he was there, he was electrocuted because of negligence. And the widow in South Africa, for more than a year, did not even know which company was going to pay her out for the death of her husband. So she was very traumatized, and so was her family. And when the money slowly started coming, the mother was at her wit's end. And she turned to the pastor for help. And he would come over and provide her with the support. I'm not suggesting he crossed the line, but the 15-year-old son did think he was crossing the line. So one night, he beat the pastor to a pulp. He then grabbed the brand new motor car that had arrived that day and went for a drive and smashed the car. So there's no insurance, and the debt still has to be paid. So what we are dealing with in this particular situation is we often misunderstand the effect of the death, of what it's going to have on the kids. There are times when we're going to need to look at trauma counseling, especially if the death was violent. And that puts so much more burden on the surviving parent. The last story is typical of what happens right now. Families are spread throughout the world. And so while Granny gets to see her grandkids while they're living in South Africa, and she gets to see her son and their daughters, when they leave the country, that goes. And Granny no longer gets to meet the family, and the family doesn't get to spend as much time with Granny as she needs. And with the lockdown in COVID, situation got a lot worse. So now I am finding Granny's in intensive care in hospital. She's no longer of sound mind. Now the family rush in, and they find out the frail care center somehow cleared Granny's room. All her bank cards are now in the hands of her friends. They've got PIN numbers to those bank cards. Her car is being driven by a friend, and nobody can work out what's happening. And because she is no longer of sound mind, the power of attorney that the family now has can't be applied. And now we've got to go to court. We've got to get attorneys involved. We've got to look at to what extent there was not due care, and what are we going to do about it. So folks, be aware, you have to plan. And if you fall into the particular last category, you need to take care. You cannot, on a piece of paper, signed 12, 13, 14 years ago, use that to now try and work out what has happened to your mother's estate. And in this case, where her friends possibly have emptied out the bank account, it becomes really difficult to deal with. Planning, planning, planning. Take care to get your planning done ahead of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nico.